The village of Hawthorne End lay beneath a delicate frosting of snow, as though some careful hand had dusted each hedgerow and cottage roof with powdered sugar. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, church bells rehearsed a tentative peal for Christmas Eve, and the narrow high street glowed with the soft amber light of shop windows displaying tins of shortbread, jars of lemon curd, and paper crowns arranged with deliberate cheer. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible grey coat and woollen scarf, paused at the gate of Rosebank Cottage and surveyed the scene with gentle approval. There was something reassuring, she always thought, about villages at Christmas. They pretended, just for a little while, that good will truly reigned, yet in her long experience Christmas also had a habit of loosening tongues and sharpening resentments. Inside Rosebank the kettle had only just begun to sing when the telephone rang. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Very few people rang her before elevenses. She crossed the sitting-room, careful not to disturb the neatly folded knitting laid upon her armchair, and lifted the receiver. Miss Marple speaking. No, thank goodness, came the familiar voice of Colonel Arthur Bantry, brisk yet strained. I'm afraid there's been, well, something most unpleasant. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around the receiver. At Christmas, Arthur, she murmured, how very inconsiderate. It's at Greystone Manor. The Colonel continued, old Mrs. Pemberton, she's dead. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Greystone Manor stood at the edge of Hawthorne End like a dowager refusing to downsize, solid, dignified, and faintly resentful of the modern world. It belonged to Mrs. Elena Pemberton, a woman of formidable presence and formidable opinions, widowed for over 20 years and possessed of both considerable wealth and an unshakable belief in family hierarchy, natural causes. Miss Marple asked quietly. There was a pause. That's just it, said Colonel Bantry. It doesn't seem to be, and with all the family gathered for Christmas. He trailed off. Miss Marple sighed. Well, she said, reaching for her gloves, I suppose I'd better come over. Greystone Manor rose from the snowy grounds like something from a Christmas car. Clad stone walls, mullioned windows glowing warmly, and a wreath of holly fixed sternly to the front door. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but festive. The entrance hall smelled faintly of pine and furniture polish. A tall Christmas tree stood in one corner, its decorations tasteful to the point of austerity, silver baubles, white candles, and no tinsel whatsoever. Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Jennings the Long, serving housekeeper, whose lips were pressed so tightly together they seemed in danger of vanishing altogether. She's in the blue drawing-room, Mrs. Jennings said in a low voice. The doctor's been, and the police are expected shortly. Miss Marple nodded and followed her. The blue drawing-room was a high, ceilinged space with tall windows overlooking the frozen lawn. Mrs. Elena Pemberton lay upon a chaise longue, arranged with an unsettling neatness. She wore a dark green velvet dress and a pearl brooch shaped like a sprig of mistletoe. On a small table beside her rested a porcelain teacup, half full. Miss Marple took this in at once, her eyes sharp beneath their mild gaze. Colonel Bantry stood near the fireplace, his ruddy face unusually pale. It was the tea, he said quietly. Dr. Wells thinks it may have been poisoned. Miss Marple glanced at the cup again. Arsenic has a way of announcing itself, she murmured, but there are other substances, gentler, quieter ones. She turned her attention to the occupants of the room. The family and guests' Christmas at Greystone Manor had brought together a gathering that Mrs. Pemberton herself referred to never kindly as necessary obligations. Henry Pemberton, her elder son, stood stiffly near the window. A tall man with thinning hair and an air of habitual disappointment Henry had devoted his life to managing the estate and waiting for recognition that never quite came. Beside him hovered his wife, Margaret Pemberton, a delicate woman with anxious eyes and a perpetual air of apology. She clutched her handbag as though it might float away. On the opposite side of the room lounged Clara Whitcomb, Mrs. Pemberton's niece. Clara was modern in both dress and manner, wearing a tailored wool suit and a faintly ironic expression. She had returned from London only days before, bringing with her a whiff of city sophistication and family tension. Near the doorway stood Edward Pemberton, the younger son. Edward smiled too readily, his charm just a shade too polished. Known in Hawthorne End for his talent at spending money faster than he earned it, Edward had been the subject of many a whispered conversation. Lastly, there was Miss Lucy Harcourt, Mrs. Pemberton's companion of 5 years. Plain, efficient, and observant, Miss Harcourt had the look of a woman accustomed to being overlooked, and perhaps resented for her closeness to wealth. Miss Marple surveyed them all with polite interest, as though assessing contestants at a village flower show. "So sad," she said gently, just before Christmas. Margaret Pemberton dabbed at her eyes. Edward cleared his throat. Clara said nothing. The heirloom, it was Clara who finally broke the silence. "Aunt Elena was quite animated this afternoon," she said. Almost cheerful, Henry shot her a sharp look. She had reason, Clara continued. She intended to announce her decision about the snowdrop chalice. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "The snowdrop chalice," she echoed. Colonel Bantry nodded. "An old family heirloom, Elizabethan silver if I'm not mistaken, quite valuable, and quite sentimental," Clara added. "It's supposed to be left to the most worthy descendant." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very subjective," she said. Henry's face flushed. "My mother had not yet made any announcement," he said stiffly. "Clara is speculating." "Oh, but she had," Clara replied coolly. "She told me she'd decided, and she planned to reveal it tonight, after tea." Miss Marple glanced once more at the porcelain cup. "And now," she said softly, "she will not." A village parallel. As Miss Marple waited for the arrival of the police, she allowed her thoughts to wander, a habit that had served her exceedingly well over the years. This situation reminded her strongly of old Mrs. Reynolds from St. Mary Mead, who had promised her pearl necklace to whichever niece behaved best at Christmas. The necklace had vanished, and so had Mrs. Reynolds, into an extremely convenient bout of indigestion, later discovered to be something far more deliberate. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, did not change simply because the wallpaper did. The tea. Mrs. Jennings returned with a tray. "Inspector Mallory will be here shortly," she said. "I thought you might like some tea, Miss Marple." Miss Marple looked at the tray, and then at the teapot. "Was this the same pot?" she asked mildly. Mrs. Jennings stiffened. "Yes, miss." Miss Marple nodded. "Then perhaps I shall wait." She turned instead to Miss Harcourt. "You prepared Mrs. Pemberton's tea?" "Yes," Miss Harcourt said. "As I always do. She liked it weak, milk first." Miss Marple smiled. "How very particular," she murmured. "People often are when they believe themselves in control." A first disturbance, the sound of a raised voice, drifted in from the hall. "Absolutely ridiculous," Edward was saying. "You can't seriously think—" Inspector Mallory entered moments later, a practical man with kind eyes and a notebook already half filled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'm afraid this may take some time." Miss Marple met his gaze. "I imagine it will," she said pleasantly. "Christmas murders so often do." Inspector Mallory raised an eyebrow. "And you are Jane Marple?" she replied. "I live just down the lane." His expression softened. "Ah," he said, "then we are in capable company." Miss Marple looked once more at Mrs. Pemberton's still face, the untouched announcement, the poisoned tea, and the silver chalice waiting somewhere in the house to be claimed. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft, silent, and utterly indifferent to human greed, and Miss Marple knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that before Christmas Day dawned, the truth would demand to be unwrapped. Inspector Mallory had always believed that country house murders were exaggerated affairs invented by novelists. Yet as he stood in the blue drawing-room of Greystone Manor, notebook in hand, surrounded by strained faces and an air thick with unspoken grievance, he revised his opinion. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had settled herself into a straight, backed chair near the window, her knitting resting innocently in her lap. To the casual observer she appeared merely an elderly lady occupying herself, while professionals did their work. Inspector Mallory, however, had already learned not to underestimate Miss Marple's particular talent for seeing precisely what others overlooked. "Now then," he began briskly, "I'll need to ask you all a few questions, not accusations, just facts." Edward Pemberton gave a short laugh. "Facts are so often disappointing." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. The timeline. Inspector Mallory began with the most obvious. "Mrs. Pemberton took tea at 4 o'clock, I'm told." "Yes," said Miss Harcourt. "As she always did, in the blue drawing-room. Who was present?" Miss Harcourt hesitated. "Mr. Henry Pemberton was here at first. Miss Whitcomb came in shortly after. Mrs. Pemberton dismissed us all a little before 4:30. She said she wished to think." Miss Marple glanced up. "Think about Christmas presents?" she asked mildly. Miss Harcourt flushed about her decision. Inspector Mallory made a note, and after that, "I returned at 5. Miss Harcourt continued, her voice tight. She did not answer. "I found her as you see." Henry Pemberton cleared his throat. "I left the room at 4:10, he said. "I had estate matters to attend to." Edward smirked, which usually means the brandy cupboard. Henry turned sharply. "That is enough." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at Edward. "People do say unkind things when they are frightened," she observed. "It's a little like children pulling ribbons from crackers before they've been given permission." Edward blinked, uncertain whether he had been insulted. The snowdrop chalice. Inspector Mallory turned the conversation gently but firmly back to the heirloom. "The snowdrop chalice," he said. "I'd like to know what each of you understood about Mrs. Pemberton's intentions." Henry spoke first. "The chalice has always been destined for the eldest son. That was understood. Understood by you," Clara Whitcomb said coolly, "but Aunt Elena was not a woman bound by tradition when it displeased her." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. Mrs. Fletcher of St. Mary Mead once left her silver tea service to the vicar's wife simply because she'd admired it aloud." Inspector Mallory blinked. "I beg your pardon. Just an example," Miss Marple said sweetly. Edward leaned against the mantelpiece. "My mother liked to keep us all guessing," he said. "She enjoyed leverage." "And you?" Mallory asked. "What did you hope?" Edward smiled. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Inspector, but a chalice like that could settle a number of pressing inconveniences." Margaret Pemberton gasped softly. "Edward." Miss Marple watched Margaret closely. The woman's distress seemed genuine, yet there was something else there too, fear perhaps, or relief. Miss Harcourt's position. Inspector Mallory turned to Miss Harcourt. "You lived with Mrs. Pemberton for 5 years." "Yes, and you were paid well, reasonably." Miss Marple smiled at the careful choice of word. "Mrs. Pemberton could be generous," Miss Harcourt continued, "when she chose to be." "And had she chosen you?" Mallory asked. Miss Harcourt swallowed. "She told me once that loyalty deserved recognition." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Recognition can take many forms," she said gently. "A signed photograph, for instance, or something rather heavier." Miss Harcourt's eyes flickered, just for a moment. The Village Whispers. Later that evening, Miss Marple found herself back in Hawthorne End, warming her hands around a cup of tea at the village shop, while the latest gossip was exchanged under the guise of purchasing oranges. "Oh, it's dreadful," said Mrs. Cobb, the baker's wife. "Right before Christmas, too." "Always the way," said Mrs. Turner. "Mark my words, it'll be about money." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Money, she reflected, was like Christmas pudding. Everyone insisted they didn't want it, yet watched very carefully to ensure others didn't receive more. A private conversation the next morning. Miss Marple was invited back to Greystone Manor at Inspector Mallory's request. The house felt colder without Mrs. Pemberton's presence, as though its authority had drained away. Henry Pemberton found Miss Marple in the library. "You must understand," he said stiffly, "my mother was not an easy woman. Few people worth inheriting from are," Miss Marple replied. Henry paced. She threatened to alter her will, to leave the chalice elsewhere. To whom? Miss Marple asked. Henry stopped. She did not say. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Reynolds again, and her pearl necklace. Edward's alibi. Edward, for his part, was eager to explain himself. "I was in the village at the time," he said brightly, "at the Red Lion." Miss Marple smiled. "Drinking alone, with friends. And can these friends recall the precise time?" Edward's smile faltered. "Well, Christmas is a convivial season." Miss Marple nodded. "Time does have a way of becoming elastic under the influence of good cheer." Clara's observations. Clara Whitcomb was sharper. "Aunt Elena suspected someone," she said quietly. She was frightened. "Of whom?" Miss Marple asked. Clara hesitated. She thought someone had been going through her papers. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Papers relating to the will." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "People who read what they shouldn't often hurry events," she said, "before opinions can change. The teacup Inspector Mallory had the teacup examined. There were traces of digitalis, he reported, a heart medication, in larger doses, fatal." Miss Marple nodded. "Foxglove," she murmured. "It grows very prettily in cottage gardens, quite deceptive." Inspector Mallory stared at her. "Do you know something I don't, Miss Marple?" "Only that dangerous things are often familiar," she replied. A missing object that afternoon. Mrs. Jennings approached Miss Marple in some distress. "The chalice," she whispered. "It's gone." Miss Marple did not look surprised. "When was it last seen?" "Yesterday morning. Mrs. Pemberton had it brought down from the cabinet. She wanted it polished." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "A motive wrapped in a bow," she said softly. Raising the stakes, Inspector Mallory's jaw tightened. "The heirloom is missing, the will undecided, and the poison easily obtained," he said. "Someone here believed time was running out." Miss Marple gazed out at the frost-covered lawn. "People rarely kill for what they already possess," she said, "only for what they fear losing." As the shadows lengthened over Greystone Manor and Christmas Eve drew nearer, suspicion settled upon the house like falling snow, quiet, persistent, and impossible to brush away. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The pattern, she thought, was becoming clearer. Christmas Eve arrived at Hawthorne End with a pale sun and an uneasy hush. The church bells rang dutifully, yet the sound seemed subdued, as though even they were aware that something had gone awry at Greystone Manor. Miss Marple walked up the gravel drive just after breakfast, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She carried a tin of shortbread beneath her arm, a social gesture, she knew, that often encouraged conversation more effectively than any official inquiry. Inside, the house was restless. The search for the chalice. Inspector Mallory had authorized a thorough search of Greystone Manor. Cupboards were opened, cabinets unlocked, and drawers examined with careful politeness that barely disguised the underlying tension. Mrs. Jennings wrung her hands. "That chalice has been in the family for centuries," she said. "Mrs. Pemberton used to say it watched over the house." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Objects have a way of absorbing human feelings," she said. Rather like samplers, all those careful stitches hiding so much emotion. Edward Pemberton laughed shortly. If that chalice could talk, it would beg to be melted down. Henry glared. It is not yours to discuss. Inspector Mallory made a note. A disturbing discovery. The first real shock came just before noon. Constable Reeves emerged from the upstairs corridor carrying a small velvet-lined box. "We found this behind the false panel in Mrs. Pemberton's wardrobe," he said. Inside lay the snowdrop chalice, or rather most of it. The base was intact, the delicate floral engraving unmistakable, but the bowl itself had been crudely separated. Edward whistled. "Well," he said, "that's sacrilege." Miss Marple leaned forward. "May I?" she asked. She examined the severed edge carefully. "Not a jeweller's work," she observed. "Someone in a hurry." Inspector Mallory frowned. "Why take part of it and leave the rest?" Miss Marple set the chalice down. "Sentiment," she said, "or guilt?" Margaret Pemberton's secret Margaret was the next to falter. Miss Marple found her in the morning-room, twisting her handkerchief into a tightrope. "I never wanted it," Margaret burst out. "The chalice, I mean." Miss Marple sat beside her. "Very few people want trouble," she said kindly. "It often comes anyway." Margaret's eyes filled. "Elena promised it to Henry years ago, but then she changed." "Because of Edward?" Miss Marple asked. Margaret shook her head. "Because of me." Miss Marple waited. "She thought I was weak, and perhaps I am, but she said weakness should not inherit strength." Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Pemberton's fondness for moral tests. "And you?" she asked. "What did you do?" Margaret whispered. "I went into her room. I looked at the chalice just once." Miss Marple nodded. "Looking is rarely a crime," she said, "unless one sees something one shouldn't." Margaret broke down in sobs. Edward under pressure. Edward's charm began to crack under scrutiny. Inspector Mallory confronted him with the incomplete chalice. "You were in debt," he said, "gambling by several accounts." Edward's smile slipped. "I intended to borrow against it," he said. "Not this." "Borrow from whom?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Edward hesitated. "A man in London." Miss Marple nodded. "There's always a man in London." Edward's alibi unravelled further when the landlord of the Red Lion admitted Edward had left early. "Before 4, he said he had something to attend to." Miss Marple observed Edward closely. "People often rush when they believe they are expected," she said, "even when they are not." Clara's motive, Clara Whitcomb, cool and composed, remained an enigma. "You disliked your aunt," Inspector Mallory said plainly. "I disliked her control," Clara replied, "not her." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And yet you returned from London at precisely the right moment." Clara smiled thinly. "I was summoned." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. Clara hesitated. "Aunt Elena wrote to me. She said she needed someone sensible." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Sensible people are often invited to witness decisions," she murmured. The poison's source. Inspector Mallory made another discovery. The digitalis could have come from foxglove, he said. "There's a patch in the kitchen garden." Mrs. Jennings gasped. "I use it for the bees," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. Beauty and usefulness are not mutually exclusive." Miss Harcourt stood very still. Miss Harcourt's past. Miss Marple requested a private word with Miss Harcourt. "You were very devoted," Miss Marple said gently. "I was employed," Miss Harcourt replied, and before Greystone. Miss Harcourt stiffened. "I cared for an elderly gentleman in Bath." "And did he leave you anything?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Harcourt's voice was barely audible. "He intended to." Miss Marple sighed, but someone else objected. Miss Harcourt looked away. "People resent efficiency," she said bitterly. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "They resent replacement," she said. A second incident that evening. Just as the household gathered for a strained Christmas Eve supper, a cry rang out from the corridor. Mrs. Jennings had collapsed. Inspector Mallory hurried forward. "Another poisoning?" he demanded. "No," said the doctor, arriving breathlessly. "Shock, exhaustion." Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Fear can mimic death," she said. "It is most convincing." A pattern emerges later. Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing-room, staring into the dying fire. Mrs. Reynolds, the pearl necklace, the niece who rushed things, the foxglove, the teacup, the missing part of the chalice. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched. "The trouble with heirlooms," she murmured, "is that they encourage haste." She rose slowly. "I think," she said aloud, "I know what happened." A quiet test the following morning. Miss Marple asked Inspector Mallory for a small favour. "I'd like the family assembled," she said, "and the chalice brought down." Inspector Mallory studied her. "You're certain?" "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Christmas is a time for revelations." As snow began to fall once more over Hawthorne End, the household gather, each carrying secrets as carefully as wrapped presents. And Miss Marple prepared to unwrap the most dangerous one of all. The drawing-room at Greystone Manor had rarely held such an uncomfortable assembly. Chairs were drawn into a loose semicircle, the fire burned low, and the snowdrop chalice, what remained of it, sat upon a small table draped with a lace cloth. Miss Marple stood beside it, her hands folded, her expression mild. Inspector Mallory leaned against the mantelpiece, arms crossed. "Miss Marple believes she has something to tell us," he announced. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I do hope you will forgive an old woman for meddling," she began. "But village life teaches one a great deal about people and their habits." Edward shifted impatiently. "If this is another lecture," Miss Marple smiled at him, "it is more of a reminiscence. The heirloom's true value, the snowdrop chalice," Miss Marple said, "has always been described as priceless, but that is not entirely accurate." She picked it up carefully. "The silver is valuable, yes, but not enough to justify murder." Edward frowned. "Then why?" "Because," Miss Marple continued gently, "its true value lay elsewhere." Inspector Mallory straightened. "You mean the will?" Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Pemberton was a woman who enjoyed moral theatre. She liked to observe how people behaved when tempted. Clara folded her arms. "She was cruel, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but she was also cautious." The hidden compartment. Miss Marple turned the chalice slightly. When Mrs. Jennings brought it down to be polished, she mentioned Mrs. Pemberton had handled it rather longer than usual. Mrs. Jennings nodded vigorously. "She was examining it, miss, very carefully." Miss Marple's fingers traced the engraved snowdrops. "There is a hidden compartment," she said calmly. A murmur ran through the room. Inspector Mallory leaned forward. "You're certain?" "Quite. I've seen something similar in a Victorian vinaigrette belonging to Mrs. Bartlett of St. Mary Mead. Her nephew found it most inconvenient." Edward went pale. "What was hidden?" the compartment contained. Miss Marple continued. "A revised will." Silence fell. Mrs. Pemberton did not trust drawers or safes. Miss Marple said she trusted sentiment. She believed no one would damage the chalice, except someone in a hurry. Inspector Mallory said slowly. Miss Marple nodded. "Someone who feared losing everything, who knew not everyone knew about the compartment." Miss Marple said, "Only those who had seen Mrs. Pemberton open it." Miss Harcourt's hands trembled. "She showed me," Miss Harcourt said quietly, "last week." Miss Marple inclined her head. "She valued your efficiency." Miss Harcourt swallowed. "She said she was thinking of leaving it to me." Margaret gasped. Miss Marple held up a hand. "Not the chalice," she said. "The house." Henry stiffened. "That's impossible." Miss Marple met his gaze. Mrs. Pemberton believed caretaking was a form of inheritance. The tea revisited. Miss Marple turned back to the teacup. "Digitalis must be taken in a precise dose," she said. "Too much and death is swift. Too little and it merely alarms." Inspector Mallory nodded. "The dose was exact, which suggests experience." Miss Marple said softly, "Not rage." She looked at Miss Harcourt. "You prepared the tea," she said, "but you did not poison it." Miss Harcourt looked up, shocked. "I did not. I know." Miss Marple said kindly, "You are too methodical. You would never risk a visible residue." Inspector Mallory looked sharply at Edward. "Edward's desperation, Edward," Miss Marple said, "you were the one in debt. You were the one who left the Red Lion early, and you were the one who broke the chalice." Edward laughed harshly. "So I'm guilty of panic. That doesn't make me a murderer." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, panic comes after the fact." Edward's face twitched. Henry's quiet fury. Miss Marple turned slowly to Henry. "You managed the estate. You believed the chalice was yours by right." "It was," Henry said. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "your mother intended to pass over you." Henry's jaw tightened. She was mistaken. Was she? Miss Marple asked gently, or had she noticed something? Inspector Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Your mother discovered someone tampering with her papers." Henry said nothing. The final thread. Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Henry visited the blue drawing-room after preparing the tea," she said calmly. "He added the digitalis, a substance he knew well from treating sheep on the estate." Henry flinched. "You had access, you had knowledge, and you had motive." Margaret cried out, "No." Miss Marple turned to her. "You believed Henry incapable of cruelty," she said softly, "just as Mrs. Pemberton once did." Henry's voice broke. She was going to give everything away. Miss Marple nodded. "And that," she said, "is why you acted." Setting the trap. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "The broken chalice," he asked. "A cover." Miss Marple said, "Edward broke it later, hoping to retrieve what Henry had already taken, the will." Edward stared. There was nothing inside. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Because Henry had already removed it." Henry's shoulders sagged. The confession. Henry sank into a chair. "I only meant to frighten her," he whispered. She drank the tea so quickly. Miss Marple closed her eyes. People often underestimate how final small acts can be. Inspector Mallory nodded grimly. "I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me, Mr. Pemberton." Christmas truths. As Henry was led away, Miss Marple turned to the others. "Mrs. Pemberton hid her will where she believed it would be safe," she said, "but she forgot one thing." "What?" Clara asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People who feel entitled do not fear breaking what they think already belongs to them." Outside, the church bells began to ring for Christmas Eve. Miss Marple looked at the broken chalice. "Even the finest heirlooms," she said softly, "cannot survive greed." A Christmas morning dawned over Hawthorne End with a pale, forgiving light. Snow lay smooth and unbroken across the fields, and the village church bells rang with renewed confidence, as though relieved that truth, like the day itself, had finally arrived. At Greystone Manor, however, the house felt altered. Not empty, precisely, but stripped of its former authority. Mrs. Elena Pemberton's presence lingered in every corridor, yet the fear she had inspired had vanished, replaced by something quieter and more enduring, consequence. Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly after 9, her boots leaving careful impressions on the gravel drive. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, a Christmas gift for Mrs. Jennings, she explained later, though she never did say what it contained. Inspector Mallory met her in the hall. "It's over, then," he said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It always is, eventually. Even the longest winters end." Aftermath. Henry Pemberton's arrest had been conducted with minimal drama. There had been no shouting, no final defiance, only a weary compliance that spoke of years spent believing himself wronged. Margaret Pemberton had not slept. "She keeps asking where Henry is," Inspector Mallory said quietly as they walked, as though he simply stepped out. Miss Marple nodded. Shock does that. It preserves the familiar until the mind can face the truth. Edward, by contrast, had disappeared early that morning, ostensibly to London. He left a note, Mallory added, said he needed a change of scenery. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Scenery rarely changes character, she said, but people often try. The reading of the will, the family solicitor arrived just before noon, his briefcase polished to a dull shine. The household gathered once more in the drawing-room, this time without pretence. Miss Harcourt sat quietly near the window, hands folded. Clara Whitcomb stood apart, observing everything with sharp, appraising eyes. The solicitor cleared his throat. The late Mrs. Elena Pemberton executed a revised will 3 weeks before her death. Henry's absence seemed to echo in the room. The snowdrop chalice, the solicitor continued, was never intended as an inheritance in itself. It was a repository. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. The house and grounds, the solicitor read, are to be left to Miss Lucy Harcourt, in recognition of her loyalty and service. Margaret gave a small cry. Miss Harcourt looked stunned. The remaining estate is to be divided between Henry Pemberton and Edward Pemberton, on the condition that the manor remain intact. Clara exhaled softly. And me? She asked. The solicitor glanced up. A personal letter, he said. No material bequest. Clara smiled faintly. That sounds like her. Understanding Mrs. Pemberton later, as the others dispersed, Miss Marple and Clara found themselves alone near the fire. She wanted to teach us something. Clara said quietly, yes. Miss Marple replied, though I'm afraid lessons taught with threats often end badly. She was afraid, Clara said, of being forgotten. Miss Marple nodded. People who collect heirlooms are often afraid of impermanence. Edward's reckoning, Edward Pemberton, returned to Greystone Manor 2 days later, summoned by Inspector Mallory. His bravado had diminished. I didn't kill her, he said quickly. You know that. Yes, said Miss Marple, who had been invited to sit in, but you broke the chalice. Edward looked away. I thought the will was inside. I panicked. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. You destroyed something irreplaceable because you believed it was already yours. Edward flushed. I suppose, he said bitterly, that runs in the family. Inspector Mallory closed his notebook. You won't be charged, he said. But your debts remain. Edward laughed weakly. Some punishments are long-term. Miss Marple nodded. Those are usually the most instructive. Miss Harcourt's choice. Miss Harcourt did not celebrate her inheritance. I don't know if I can stay. She confessed to Miss Marple later that afternoon. This house, it feels heavy. Miss Marple smiled. Houses are like people, she said. They must be lived in kindly to improve. Miss Harcourt hesitated. Mrs. Pemberton trusted me. I don't wish her memory to become bitterness. Miss Marple touched her arm, then fill it with better memories. That is the only way to soften the past. Margaret's quiet strength, Margaret Pemberton, surprised them all. She declined to leave with Edward, choosing instead to remain temporarily at Greystone Manor. I've been quiet for too long, she said to Miss Marple. I mistook silence for virtue. Miss Marple smiled approvingly. Many women do, she said. They discover too late that still water runs deepest and strongest. Henry's confession, the confession when it came, was unremarkable in its simplicity. Henry admitted to adding the digitalis after overhearing his mother's intention to disinherit him. I only wanted to stop her, he said, to force her to reconsider. Miss Marple listened quietly. People who believe themselves indispensable are often the most dangerous. She said softly, they cannot imagine a world without their authority. Henry said nothing. The broken heirloom, the snowdrop chalice, was never repaired. Miss Harcourt chose instead to place it in a small cabinet in the hallway. Broken, yet honoured, it reminds us, she said, that beauty does not protect against greed. Miss Marple approved. In St. Mary Mead, she said, We keep cracked teacups for precisely the same reason. Christmas evening on Christmas evening, Miss Marple returned home to Rosebank Cottage. She set her knitting aside, poured herself a modest glass of sherry, and sat by the fire. Outside, children sang carols. Somewhere down the lane a door closed gently. She reflected, as she often did, on the patterns of human behaviour. The heirloom had not caused the murder, nor had the money, nor even the will. It had been certainty, the most dangerous possession of all. Inspector Mallory's farewell. Inspector Mallory stopped by the following day. "I don't suppose you'll ever consider assisting officially," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh no, that would spoil everything." He laughed. "You see things before others do." Miss Marple shook her head. "I simply recognize them. People behave much the same everywhere, whether in villages or grand houses. Epilogue spring would come to Hawthorne End, as it always did. Snow would melt, gardens would bloom, the manor would endure changed but not destroyed. Miss Harcourt would learn to manage the house with quiet confidence. Margaret would find her voice. Clara would return to London lighter than before. And Miss Jane Marple would return to her knitting, her roses, and her unshakable belief that evil, like foxglove, often grows in familiar soil, and must be handled with care. She lifted a teacup to Christmas. She murmured, "A time when the truth insists on being unwrapped."